Good day, everyone. I am Roi Mesias, together with Miss Cindy Jutara and Miss Sjhamaicka Rosete. We will be tackling about cultural poetics or new historicism as an alternative approach to textual interpretation. Cultural poetics, which emerged as an alternative approach to textual interpretation in the 1970s and 1980s, and is also known as New Historicism in United States and Cultural Materialism in United Kingdom, asserts that all history is subjective, written by individuals whose personal biases influence their interpretation of the past. Cultural poetics says that history cannot provide us the objective truth or a completely accurate depiction of past events, people, or eras, nor the worldwide of a group. The new historicism places a great deal of emphasis on examining the text within its historical and cultural concept. According to new historicists, no text can exist without historical and cultural context. Now, according to new historicism, literature is connected to the time in which it was produced, the author who wrote it, and the historical events that occurred during the time in which the literary work or work of art was created. So, simply put, new historicism approach examines the historical background of a context. Like, for example, the time in which it was produced, the author who wrote it, and the historical events that occurred during that time or when the literary work was created.
Now, let's talk about the origin of historicism. Although no one can give a comprehensive and contestable history of New Historicism's development, its distinctively American form began to germinate in the late 1970s and early 1980s, particularly with the publication of two pivotal works of Renaissance scholarship in 1980. Renaissance Self-Fashioning, From Moore to Shakespeare and Eliza Queen of Shepherds, and The Pastoral of Power by Louise Montrose. These works elucidate the issues that cultural poetics would address in the 1980s and 1990s. 2 years later, in 1982, cultural poetics merged into a site of literary theory with the publication of Greenblatt's new journal, Genre. In the journal's introduction to a collection of Renaissance essays, Greenblatt declared that a new historicism had emerged, proclaiming that new historicism had become a legitimate, unrespected voice in literary theory's ongoing dialogue. In 1983, Greenblatt and Svetlana Applers, along with a Berkeley-based editorial board, launched Representations, which quickly became the primary publication for new historicist scholars such as D.A. Miller in his essay Discipline and Different Voices, Bureaucracy, Police, Family, and Bleak House, Louis A. Montrose in his essay Shaping Fantasies, and Jonathan Goldberg's James I. and the Politics of Literature, Jansen, Shakespeare, Donne, and Their Contemporaries.
Let us define New Historicism. So New Historicism is a method based on the parallel reading of literary and non-literary texts, usually of the same historical period. So non-literary texts include newspapers, magazines, biographies, travel guides, and radio broadcasts. So in contrast, literary texts consist of stories, novels, poetry, and others. So new historicists believe that literary and non-literary texts written during the same historical period must be studied parallel. So for instance, if a critic wishes to analyze The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, you must consider the non-literary works published at the same time to gain a complete understanding of the literary work. So another definition, which is according to Louis Montrose, New Historicism is a combined interest in the textuality of history and the text historicity. So Louis believes that history and the text are interconnected. So there is a history contained within the text and text contained within the history. So both influence one another. New Historicism is the most recent approach to literary theory and criticism based on the notion that a literary work should be viewed as a product of the time, place, and historical circumstances in which it was written. New historicists attempt to comprehend a work of art through its historical and cultural context and the cultural history of the nation or region in which it was written or produced.
So you may be curious as to why it is called New Historicism. There should be a whole old historicism to exist if there is New Historicism. And to comprehend New Historicism, we must comprehend the central concepts and determine how New Historicism differs from Old Historicism rather. The first of the six central concepts: history is written on the basis of interpretations and not facts. Thus, all historical accounts are narratives that can be analyzed using many of the same techniques employed by literary critics. The new historicists believe we have access to only the most fundamental historical facts. Even when the traditional historians believe that they are sticking to the facts, the manner in which they contextualize those facts, including which facts are deemed important enough to report and which are omitted, determines the narrative that those facts will tell. New historicists argue that it is difficult to produce reliable interpretations for a variety of reasons. Second key concept to remember is that history is neither linear, because A does not lead to effect B and effect B does not lead to effect C, nor progressive, because the human species is not steadily improving over the course of time. The complexity of history also contributes to the difficulty of producing reliable interpretations of the past. Now, for new historicists, history cannot be viewed as a straightforward progression of events. A culture may be progressing in some areas and regressing in others at any point in history. And any two historians may disagree on what constitutes progress and what does not, as these terms are definitional in nature. Third is that never is power wholly confined to a single individual or social stratum. According to the French philosopher Michel Foucault, power flows constantly in all directions, to and from all social levels. And the vehicle by which power circulates is a never-ending proliferation of exchange, including exchanges of material goods, exchanges of human beings, and, most significantly, for literary critics, exchanges of ideas through the various discourses a culture produces.
The fourth of the six central concepts of New Historicism is: no single discourse can adequately explain the complex cultural dynamics of social power from a new historical perspective. There is no monolithic or single unified universal spirit of an age, and there is no adequate explanation of history that encompasses the entirety of time, or an explanation that provides a single key to all aspects of a given culture. There is only a dynamic, unstable interplay between discourses, the meanings of which the historian can attempt to analyze, though such an analysis will always be partial and account for only a portion of the historical picture. The fifth central concept of New Historicism is: personal identity, like historical events, texts, and artifacts, is shaped by the culture from which it emerges and also shapes the culture. Thus, cultural categories such as normal and abnormal, sane and insane, are defined by their respective meanings. In other words, our individual identity is comprised of the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, and the material for these stories is derived from the circulation of discourses that constitutes our culture. Lastly, all analyses of the past are necessarily subjective. Therefore, historians must reveal the ways in which they recognize that their own cultural experiences position them to interpret the past. The inevitability of personal bias necessitates that new historians be as conscious and forthright as possible regarding their own psychological and ideological positions in relation to the material they analyze, so that their readers can understand the lens through which they view the historical issues at hand. This method is known as self-positioning.
What are the concepts that cultural poetics rejects? First, monological interpretations of a given culture, people, or historical era can accurately demonstrate that culture's beliefs and values. Second, a historian can establish the norms and the truth of any social order. Third, a writer or a historian can be totally objective. Fourth, autonomous artifacts, including literary texts, can or do exist. Fifth, literature is shaped by only historic moments. History serves as a background for literary study. Sixth, only one correct interpretation of a text exists. What cultural poetics does and exacts? It intentionally smudges the line between history and literature, believing that text, which is literature, and context, history, are the same, and that literature has no history of its own but is ensconced in cultural history. It admits that definitive interpretations of a text are unattainable because relevant material concerning a given text or action is too diffuse to be exhaustively gathered. We can thus never recover the original meaning of any event or text because we cannot hear all the voices that contributed to that event or collect and experience all the data surrounding that event's or text's creation. It recognizes that power affects literature as deeply as it does history. Some narratives are unjustly stifled, being intentionally repressed, subordinated, and forgotten. When uncovered, these seemingly trivial stories or mini-narratives have a surprisingly significant impact, impeding the creation of an overarching historical narrative. It believes that text, like all forms of discourse, helps shape and are shaped by social forces. It looks to single moments in history that may have influenced or been influenced by a literary text produced at the time, relying heavily on historical documents to discover the significant moment. History can no longer be considered simply background information for textual analysis, but an essential element in the interpretive process. It believes that literature is shaped by historical moments while also shaping the individual reader or listener to these texts. It believes that one of the most important elements in textual analysis is discovering how a text was formed, that is, investigating the historical and social moments surrounding a text's production, not its supposed interpretation. It believes that writers, like texts, are subjected to social biases, cultural influences, and political agendas. No writer or critic can ever be entirely objective.
Now, how do we analyze a context based on new historicism? These are some questions that you might need to ask yourself when you textualize a context or a literary work in a new historicism approach. Stephen Greenblatt and other critics recommend that when analyzing any text from a cultural poetics or new historicism perspective, we ask and investigate the following questions. First, what kinds of behavior or models of practice does this work reinforce? Next, why might readers at a particular time and place find this work compelling? Third is, are there differences between your values and the values implicit in the work you are reading? Fourth, on what social understanding does the work depend? Fifth, whose freedom of thought or movement might be constrained implicitly or explicitly by this work? Sixth, what are the larger social structures with which these particular acts of praise or blame might be connected? 7. What authorial biographical facts are relevant to the text? And lastly, what other cultural events occurred surrounding the original production of the text, and how many these events be relevant to the text under investigation?
In conclusion, Cultural Poetics, which emerged in the 1970s and 1980s as an alternative approach to textual interpretation and is also known as New Historicism in the United States and Cultural Materialism in the United Kingdom, asserts that all history is subjective, written by individuals whose personal biases influence their interpretation of the past. Cultural Poetics argues that history cannot provide us with the objective truth or entirely accurate portrayal of past events, people, or eras, nor the worldview of a group. New Historicism critics examine the text by considering the following factors. First, the time at which the text was composed. Second, the author of the literary work. Third, the historical events that occurred at that time the literature was composed. Fourth, how the form literature is presented today has evolved over time. Lastly, what message did it convey to the target audience and what did it mean to the readers?
I think that is all for our report. We hope that this video presentation has given you a much clearer understanding of Cultural Poetics or New Historicism. If you have questions and clarifications about this, let us know, and we will try our best to answer it. Thank you everyone. Have a good day!